right, so I want to talk a little bit about chapter 1 and deal with chapter 1, and I'll try to do an update for each one of these chapters to kind of give you some cliff notes to dealing with that. One of the things that I want to make clear is that people have organized themselves in systems in order to get things done. And so when we think about systems, what we're thinking about are these small parts, and we'll spend some time talking about these small parts, that unite to perform a function or a purpose so that things can be replicated, right? So that replication can occur, right? So replication. So systems are the small parts, these individual things that unite to perform a function or a purpose so that replication can occur. So the system is designed so that replication continually happens, right? So if we think about environmental systems, there are all these individual pieces of the environment that work together to create an environmental system. If you think about rain, right? So many of us were taught that water from lakes and streams evaporates, goes into the upper atmosphere, becomes clouds. When those clouds become heavy with moisture and they hit like a mountain, it rains. That rain runs down the mountain and into lakes and streams, and therefore we have this whole ecosystem of rain. And so environmental systems are ecosystems. We also have family systems. So we have individuals who have roles that keep the family going so that the successes of that family can be replicated. And we'll talk about the success because that's a loaded term as well. And we look at governmental systems. They're designed to carry out what people have said are successful ways of being and interacting. So systems are important. So we have all of these kinds of systems, and we also have oppressive systems. And oppressive systems are designed to create a line between the oppressed and the oppressor, those who benefit from the labor and the talent and the life energy of the subordinate group. So we have the oppressive group, or the dominant group, and we have the target group, which is the group that's under this oppressive system. So people benefit from this, and people are denied benefits given this particular system. So oppressive system. So when we start talking about multicultural counseling, when we start talking about diversity training, or we talk about social justice issues, what we're talking about typically is in relationship to oppressive systems and the neuroses that creates. So when the image of myself and the image that the world sees me as, when there's not a match between that distance between how the world sees me and how I see myself could be considered neuroses, right? So if I'm operating in an oppressive system and I see myself one way, but the system is treating me another way, then that is a cause of neurotic behavior or neuroses. So I see myself as an upstanding citizen. I pay my taxes and I participate in the democratic process, and I go into a store and they treat me as if I'm a criminal. That could then start and what I mean by that is they follow me through the store. They don't give me adequate help when I actually need help. They give me too much help when I don't need that help. And so that can cause neurotic behavior or neuroses. So behavior that majority culture might not necessarily understand, but those who are all suffering in this oppressive system have an acute awareness to, even if that thing hasn't happened to them, because they can see that it's very similar to a hurt that's been inflicted on them. right? So, and we'll get back to hurt and all those things in just a second. So, when dealing with different groups of people, we deal with multicultural groups, a lot of times some triggers that people might have because they've operated in systems that have oftentimes been oppressive, some of those triggers or ways that this oppressive system acts is it acts in regards to sexism, racism, or heterosexism, or something that I like to use, ableism, which is the oppression or suppression of goods and access to goods, jobs, services, and money based on someone's ability. So, or physical ability, so or mental ability, or emotional ability, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So sexism is the form of oppression that is based on gender, right? So that's based on gender. Racism, obviously, is a form of oppression based on the race concept, right? The so-called race. Heterosexism has more to do with gender identity, what gender identities are acceptable, and then ableism is denying of access to goods, jobs, services, and money to people with a physical, mental, or emotional so-called disability, right? And so when we see the word, when we see ISM, what we understand is that is a process, right? And particularly these kinds of isms are related to a system of oppression, and we'll spend some time talking about systems of oppression. And because I've operated in a world that has some of these, now there are many other forms of oppression that operate, but we'll just talk about these four, and hopefully you'll get the principle to be able to apply them to other things, right? So there's a concept called lookism or sizeism or colorism. So depending on, if you are a full-figured individual, you get access to goods, jobs, services, and money differently than a slim person, or if you're attractive, whatever attraction means in the dominant culture, you get a certain amount of benefit, or you get some so-called privilege associated with those things. So understanding that people operate and that these pieces that fall under this oppressive system cause neuroses, then what that leads us to is that oftentimes people have different worldviews because of their interaction with one of these or a combination of these oppressive systems. And the interesting thing about oppressive systems is that they rob people from the opportunity to reach their potential, because the system has set up a hierarchy, if you will, of who is more worthy or less worthy based on what the system is trying to replicate as its normative principle of success, right? So people will have different worldviews, and so sexism and racism and heterosexism and ableism or people with disabilities will have different worldviews, which will cause them to behave and act differently because the world outside of them is also behaving and acting different. Now, the interesting thing about that is that there may be some commonalities in the system of oppression that people of color can, or people who fall in the victimized positions of these concepts might have some commonality around. And so this positionality of those who have been oppressed actually creates oftentimes a similar worldview with people who don't necessarily look alike or look the same. And we'll spend some time talking about that in greater detail as well. So worldview, racial identity, and gender identity. Can be powerful things to help that shape someone's worldview. Now, the interesting thing about the racial identity is that it's a twofold process. So first of all, race is determined by the government in which you find yourself under, right? So the government determines what the racial categories of a group of people are. And secondly, the people have to accept the racial identity that is given to them by their governmental entity. And so I find it interesting that a lot of students will talk about going to check off a racial category and really having some difficulty selecting what racial category for their newborn child do they want to select and why they have to do it in the first place. And I think it's interesting because the racial identity is one of these systems that is replicated because we've found ourselves in that. And so I encourage people, check something that you're not. Point being that this racial identity is almost arbitrary because there's no science, there's no biological or there's no anthropological explanations for racial identity. Gender identity. One of the things we know about gender is that we're all on a spectrum. If masculinity is on one end of the spectrum and femininity is on the other end of the spectrum, there is not one person that is all the way at either end of the spectrum. And so there are steps in between those two polar opposites, if that's the gender binary we want to use. There are also people who fall outside of that kind of gender binary and are oftentimes fluid along that continuum of sexuality or gender identity. And so those are two things that could shape one's worldview. And so we have to be mindful of that, because if we're not mindful that the system of oppression, which is designed to limit human potential, if we're not reminded of that, then we will forget what is the core root of many folks, particularly people of color, their neurotic behavior. So what is driving their neurotic behavior? And oftentimes it's these things and having to deal with the duality of not always being allowed to show up as their full selves, but having to show up in the community, having to show up at work and in school as a partial human, or only bringing the parts of themselves that are acceptable to the dominant group into those environments. The way people speak is a good example. There are certain, even myself, I find myself when I'm in professional environments, I have to pay particular attention to my articulation, to my diction, to how I phrase things. However, when I'm at home with my family, who is from southern Ohio, which is the suburb of Kentucky, I find myself slipping back into some of our family's rituals of speaking. And so not pronouncing the T in Dayton is something that would oftentimes happen in my community group. However, when I'm outside of that group, I have to be mindful that I don't want to re-stimulate any of these oppressive systems, so I articulate and try to present myself in a way that is most apt to be welcomed as a communication style. All right, and so we have to understand that those are tips. As the book continues in chapter 1, I thought it brought up some really good points about these kinds of concepts. And so if I'm not familiar with oppressive systems, if I've never been exposed to sexism or racism as a cognitive process, that I've never had to really think about those things before, it might be a bit alarming and it might be a bit upsetting. And so we'll talk about some tips that you can use to kind of overcome that. But I thought it was very interesting that the book identifies guilt and shame and fear and anger as some of the first emotions that come up as people are trying to deal with what they, the new awareness of these things. And so All of these things can be present. Here's the problem with these things. As a motivating force, how good is guilt at motivating people towards a goal? I would suggest that it's not very good at all in terms of getting the best out of people. Guilt is great if you want to get compliance out of people who are emotional. They will certainly comply with what you're saying. The same with shame. If you want compliance from folks, that may be a good way to motivate folks. But I'll tell you that that's not going to be lasting. And the other part of that shame that doesn't show up until much later is resentment. And once resentment sets in, you have a serious problem, because to unroot that is very difficult. Fear, I would say, fear is not necessarily a very good motivator either, because it only works until someone is no longer afraid. When I am no longer afraid to say what's on my mind, I'm no longer afraid to do what's in my heart, then I will do that. And anger is very short-lived. One of the things that I found very interesting with the Incredible Hulk in comic books and in the early and in the 70s, one of the things that he could not maintain was his anger. His anger would actually make him tired, and so after he did a great feat of rage, and he let that rage out, he, like most of us, became so very tired after that. And so one of the things that we know is that we can't use anger for prolonged periods of time, because it has some very negative impacts on us and the people around us. And so these are some things to be mindful of as we start talking about sexism and racism and heterosexism and ableism, and talking about different worldviews, because these oppressive systems operate and benefit from the fact that most of us don't have to think about these things. And so the book also offers some tips on how to be effective. And what I like to suggest is that you listen. And you listen, what I like to say is listen for the heart. So it is not just listening for the sake of listening. It's not listening for the sake of looking at content, but you're actually listening to hear what people are saying, even if their words don't bring those things across. And so that becomes important. So listen for the heart. Also work to build relationships with folks, right? So you may have some factual information and some statistical information about different cultural groups. You know what their population size is, you know what their education level is, you know all those things. But I will tell you, until you have a relationship with those folks, you don't know them. You don't have all that it takes to understand what their worldview is, or their racial identity, or their gender identity, until you're able to have an authentic relationship. Next, challenge your own beliefs about you. Melvin Giles, a man that I've worked on committees with, I think this man is powerful. One of the things that he says is, people will say to him, Melvin, you are a good man. And he says, do not call me a good man, because good people use that label. They use the good people label to justify doing horrible things. And so challenge your beliefs about you. What is it? So if someone says that you're sexist, take that information in and reflect on that and see, what was it about me that may have given them that impression? Or if someone says that you're racist, what is there something in me that could have done that? So challenge your own beliefs. Also recognize that your parents only had so much influence in the world. They could only go so many places in the world, and there are tons more ways of being and doing that your parents did not have access to that might be right around you and you not even be aware of those. And so we'll talk more about that as well. Acknowledge your emotions. process them, but don't lock into them, right? So don't lock into shame or guilt or fear or anger as your primary mode of operation, because that will create more darkness in your heart. And so acknowledge your feelings and emotions as they come up and process them. Find an ally, talk with friends. If you have thoughts that you're really holding on to or dealing with or wrestling with, go up and try to build relationships with someone. Ask some questions about those things. All right? You also have to stand up against dissent, particularly when someone is trying to determine that someone is less human than someone else, or it's okay to treat someone less human. Although you may not necessarily understand their worldview or their racial identity or their gender identity or some of the emotions that are associated with that, what you can stand up for is their right to be treated as a human being. So anytime the people, and even if your words aren't the best, if you're not the most articulate, that's okay. Stand up, because the more you stand up, the better you, the stronger you get at building that muscle memory, if you will, right? So the more you do it, the easier it is to do, and the more effective you become at doing it. So stand up. Play, listen, repeat. So when what I mean by play, listen, and repeat is do these actions and keep going over them and going over them and going over them until they become a habit of your behavior. And as you continue these types of tips, and you think about systems that help drive people's behavior, and you think about the oppressive systems that people are operating under that help to shape their worldviews, and how race and gender as examples get shifted to reinforce the systems that are designed to replicate behaviors, then you'll be a better counselor, a better friend, a better associate in trying to create this atmosphere for social justice.